Hello, and welcome to this fifth episode of the Geneva Center for Security Policy webinar series on global crisis, global risk, and global consequences. My name is Jean-Marc Crickley. I'm the head of Global Risk and Resilience at GCSP. The GCSP is an international nonprofit foundation physically based in Geneva, Switzerland, comprised of 52 states in its foundation council, of which all the permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, to promote and transform individuals and organizations so that they create a safer world, and we are impartial, independent, and inclusive. We rely on a community of more than 8,200 influential alumni around the world, and we provide executive education, research, public discussion, as well as innovative fellowship program for executive in transition. The first week when we started this webinar series, the coronavirus was approaching 1 million infection, and there were almost 48,000 deaths that had been counted. This week, we have more than 3.2 million infection worldwide and more than 227,000 deaths. Today's topic is on the crisis and the impact of the coronavirus crisis on US power and foreign and transatlantic relations. We have a very good panel today of speakers that I will introduce briefly now. We'll start with Anne-Lorraine Bujon. She is associate researcher at IFRI, which is the French Institute of Research on International Relations, and she's part of the North American program. She will talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on US domestic situation. Then we'll have Dr. Johanna Ralston. She is the CEO of the World Obesity Foundation. She has also had advisory position in the boards of WHO, the World Health Organization, and she's also an associate fellow at GCSP. She will talk about the impact of the crisis on US relation with the World Health Organization. Then we'll have Professor Hall Gardner. He is professor of international and comparative politics and international affairs at the American University of Paris, and he will talk about US relation with its rivals, China, Iran, and Russia. Then we'll have René Schwak, Professor René Schwak. He holds the Jean Monnet Chair of Political Science in the University of Geneva's Department of Political Science and International Relations, and he will talk about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on EU-US relations. Then we'll have Dr. Jamie Shee. He's currently Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter, but prior to that, he served for 38 years at the international staff at NATO, holding prestigious positions such as spokesman and finally, Deputy Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. He is also an associate fellow at the GCSP, and Jamie will talk about US-NATO relationship. Finally, at least, Dr. Paul Vallée is an associate fellow at the GCSP and an adjunct professor at Sciences Po Paris, and he will talk about US and European narratives on the COVID-19 crisis and the impact on transatlantic relations. Earlier this week, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, published its yearbook that surveyed the different military spending worldwide. The top 15 military spenders in the world in 2019 were the same as those in 2018. Together, the top 15 countries spent 1,553 billion in 2019, accounting for 81% of global military expenditure. With military expenditure of 732 billion, the United States remained by far the largest spender in the world in 2019, accounting for 38% of global military spending, and that represents 3.4% of its GDP. The United States spent almost as much on its military in 2019 as the next 10 highest spenders combined. US military expenditures was 5.3% higher in 2019 than in 2018. This is the second year of growth in US military spending following 7 years of continuous decline. However, despite the recent increases, US military expenditure in 2019 remained 50% lower than its peak in 2010, when the United States military burden was 49% of its GDP. China, on the other hand, the world's second largest military spender, is estimated to have allocated $261 billion to the military in 2019. That represents is 5.1% higher than what China spent in 2018, and 85% higher than what China spent in 2010. So China's military expenditure have increased continuously over the last 55 years consecutively. Global military expenditure is estimated to have been 1,917 billion in 2019, the highest level since 1988. The total was 3.6% higher in real terms in 2018 and 7.2% higher than in 2010. Worldwide military spending rose in each of the 5 years from 2015, having decreased steadily from 2011 until 2014, following the global financial and economic crisis. So this figure shows that America is still in the lead when it comes to military power, but contenders are emerging. This week also, the US has scored more than 1 million infections, and last Tuesday, it was reported that more than 58,000 people passed away to coronavirus crisis in the United States. 58,000 is symbolic because 58,220 Americans lost their life during 2 decades in Vietnam, but in 3 months, more Americans now have died from the COVID-19 than during the Vietnam War. The US has by far the most cases in the world than any other country. Has made himself the daily spokesman for the nation. Yet few Americans regularly look to or trust Trump as a source of information for the pandemic. Recent surveys show that just 28% of Americans say they regularly get information from Trump about the coronavirus crisis. But even as many Americans question Trump's credibility during the pandemic, the overwhelming majority, 82%, still approve how he's doing, which make him at a steady 32% approval rate. During this crisis, President Trump has taken some issue with mainstream US media, WHO, China, and in the past also with its NATO allies. The question of today's webinar is about the future of US power in its foreign relations and the impact the current crisis has on this future of US power. To start talking about this issue, I invite Anne-Lorraine Bujon to take the floor.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Paul Vallet and to GSCP for inviting me to participate in the seminar. I much look forward to hearing everyone's presentations. But as we were asked to be brief, let me turn straight away to my few remarks on the impact of the virus on the domestic situation in the US. And let me start by stating the obvious. We were just reminded the major figures, but the first obvious thing is that the situation in the United States is dire. So if we start with the sanitary front, so as of this morning, according to the New York Times, over 1 million people have been infected by the coronavirus, and at least 60,000 people have died. And on the economic front, still according to the New York Times, over 30 million workers have filed jobless claims over the past 6 weeks, which is the equivalent of the working population of approximately 25 states of the Union. On top of the sheer number of the people filing for unemployment, you need to keep in mind that this is happening so fast that the state agencies are having a lot of trouble processing the claims for unemployment, which means people are left with no emergency funding. So all of these figures bring us back, as we were just reminded, to two traumatic episodes in US history. The death toll in the US from the virus is now worse than that of the Vietnam War, as we were told. And the level of unemployment is now very close to what it was during the Great Depression. So the situation is not good. Now, what can we say about the consequences? I'd like to underline that the pandemic came as a shock, but it also acted first and foremost, I think, as a revelator of long-term trends and an accelerator of these same trends. Maybe the pandemic will set new dynamics in motion, but I think it's actually very early for the moment. It's not quite clear whether something really new will come out of this pandemic. Let me remind you that the pandemic is at least the third, maybe the fourth major shock for the United States since the beginning of the 21st century. The first one obviously being 9/11. The second, to my mind, being Hurricane Katrina, which I think had a lot of lessons in it that were already warnings of what is happening now. And finally, of course, the 2008 financial crisis. It's interesting for me to compare how the country has reacted to each of these shocks and to measure the difference between them. But also bear in mind that the shocks might have a cumulative effect. What can be said immediately is that after each of these shocks, the US has proved to be extraordinarily resilient on the economic front. I think we were surprised more than once. But to my mind, in terms of the social fabric or in terms of the political climate in the country, there are actually deep underlying rifts which keep growing and getting worse with each of these shocks. Which is why I'd like to ask a somewhat provocative question, which was asked by George Packer in a very good piece he just published in The Atlantic. It's in the June 2020 issue of The Atlantic. And George Packer asks, or at least he states, we are living in a failed state. So my overall question is, can the US today be said to be a failed state? Of the underlying trends I was mentioning, that the pandemic has, I think, brought to light, that it has revelated, and that it might accelerate. The first one is the pandemic highlights inequality in the US society and economy, and how this is undermining, I think, national cohesion, but also national performance. What is very obvious already is that the epidemic has hit underprivileged minorities the hardest. Okay, so the death toll is disproportionately high in the African American community, as we know, but there are also very alarming reports now coming back from Native American reservations. So there's probably a mix in these explanations, I think, are part social, but they are maybe also part genetic. Time will tell. What is obvious is that minorities are hit hardest. The epidemic has also hit harder the most exposed service workers, the invisible class, the people who power the gig economy. They need to go to work, even if there's a risk for them, and they are being hit harder, as well as medical personnel, for instance, or other categories of service workers. The pandemic has also brought out, very obviously, the loopholes in the US healthcare system. As we know, the poorest classes and the elderly are covered in the US by Medicare and Medicaid, but among the middle classes or the lower middle classes, there are still a number of people with no insurance or inefficient insurance. And that may be holding them back from seeking treatment when they need it. So I think the failings of the healthcare system in the US are now very obvious. The pandemic has, and I'm sorry for this litany of terrible news, but the pandemic has also brought out the weaknesses in public infrastructure and the differences among the different states in that regard. So unsurprisingly, when you look at the map of the US, the situation is much worse now in the urban areas on the East Coast, for instance, than in the heartland of the country. But there will be, I think, massive inequalities to be observed there as well when the situation gets better. Now, the second, I think, long-term trend that this epidemic has accelerated is that the pandemic highlights the deep crisis in political trust. Several layers of political authority are involved in handling this crisis. Mayors, governors, and of course, the federal government. This has involved some inconsistencies. It involves competition, it's testing coherence between the different policies, and there have been outright disputes and rifts between the different layers of authority. For instance, clashes between President Trump and the governor of Michigan that were very well covered by the media and maybe even exploited. So whether these different layers can work together is really a question at the moment. The crisis has also been extremely politicized by Donald Trump, first and foremost, who started by denying the crisis and describing it as a Democratic conspiracy to undermine his presidential campaign. But I think, to be honest, it needs to be said that the crisis has also been politicized by his opponents as an opportunity to criticize President Trump's mishandling of the crisis. Handling a crisis like this one, in a word, would require a competent and efficient federal bureaucracy and generally a well-functioning civil service. But the federal bureaucracy and the civil service in the United States are now weakened. Again, I think this is not new. This is long term, but it's getting worse. So they have been weakened by Reaganism, to state it briefly, that said that government is not a government is the problem, not the solution, but it does require government, obviously, to handle a crisis like this one. It's been hurt by polarization and politicization. It's been hurt by defunding. And finally, in the most recent weeks and months, I think the bureaucracy and federal government as a whole has been hurt by Trump's crusade against his own administration, which he likes to call the deep state, as we know. So this is not helping US citizens trust their government to handle the situation. So another long-term trend, and I think this is to wrap up really some of the things I was saying before, is that the pandemic reveals profound social and political divisions in the country. It's highlighting fault lines on just about every count you can think of: race, religion, region, political attitudes, values, the opposition between cities and the heartland, the issue of immigration, and also, I think, another division that has been working in the social fabric against the interests of small business versus big business. Now, Donald Trump was the worst president to think of in a crisis like this one, because since his election, Donald Trump has never tried to be a president for the whole country. He has never reached out to that part of the country that did not vote for him or try to build national unity in any kind of way. And so now this is showing, and he's just being his same old Donald Trump, trying to make every possible division worse at a time when the country would probably need some form of national cohesion. I think also the informational divide adds to this. The fact that the news coverage is so partisan, and again, this is on both sides. The fact that we've had all these debates about fake news, I think this plays a huge role in the fact that people do not trust the information they receive. The first effect of fake news, as experts show, is that it's not that people believe that the incredible stories, is that they don't believe anything anymore. And in a case of emergency, when obviously you need to believe the orders and probably respond to them, this is a huge problem. The distrust of federal government in the US is not new. Again, that's a very long-term trend. I think it's a very profound cultural thing, but it's reaching new highs at the moment, I believe. And we can see this in the number of protests there have been and civil disobedience acts against stay-at-home order. And here again, you can interpret this as a sign that American democracy is alive and well, but you could also say it's a sign that the country is coming apart. So as a conclusion, because I know we're short with time, it's still very early in the crisis to say, but I think we can make a few tentative conclusions about probable outcomes. The first one, obviously, is the US is heading towards a extremely tough economic crisis. So people are now assessing how bad it might be. Congress has passed a $2 trillion rescue package, but the rescue package, I think, is focused on helping corporations on the one hand, and it's also focused on helping individuals, but it has not focused on protecting employment as such, as opposed to what was done, for instance, in Germany or France, where the rescue packages aim to protect employment per se. So we know in the US it's easy to hire, easy to fire. But how resilient will the US economy be? Can it survive this? And especially, will small business and entrepreneurship be able to pick up, and when? I think this is really an open question. Second,
Anne-Lorraine, can I ask you to conclude?
I have three very quick points here. Second, there's no national union or reconciliation to be expected right now. I think the political division and bitterness in the US will only increase. Third, about the 2020 elections, what does this say about the 2020 elections? I think they are as uncertain as ever. Donald Trump was counting on the good economic news, and it will be bad economic news. But at the same time, his approval ratings have been fairly stable, and especially with his voter base. The crisis has shown he's inadequate, but I don't think it's bringing Joe Biden into such a glorious light either. So it leaves people speculating about another possible surprise candidate like Andrew Cuomo, but Cuomo has said he's not interested, and I think it is just speculation. In the longer term, however, and I will finish here, I think the crisis does help set a different political agenda. I'd like to highlight that healthcare was a major issue in all of the last presidential elections. Infrastructure was also a major issue. The universal basic income was discussed in the Democratic primaries. So maybe this great cycle that started with Reagan will indeed end and something new will emerge, but we don't know yet. Final note, the US has been worried about its decline for about 30 to 40 years now, and the pandemic will only increase the trend. But I think that the perception in the US of the possibility of US decline and the reality are not really in sync, and the US could surprise us once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Lorraine, for painting this, on one hand, a bleak picture for the current situation, but I think also what the reality is of the current crisis is all about. Johanna, next we'll talk about US relation with WHO.
Can you see the slides on my screen, Jean-Marc? Can you see the screen or no? You can see? Yeah,
You can see the screen.
We can see the
the
screen,
slides.
but not the slides.
You cannot see the slides. Okay, sorry. I'm just going to walk through the slides. I'm going to go back to normal view and just talk through the slides. So I'm going to speak briefly about. Thank you, first of all, very much for fantastic introduction.
Joanna, we don't see your slides. We only
I know.
see your,
I know. I think I don't want to take a lot of time trying to do this. So can you get me out of this? I'm not sure why it's not working.
You have to press stop sharing at the top of your screen.
Sure, yeah, okay, great. I'll just speak to my slides. So I'm going to speak a bit about the US and the World Health Organization. And I'll speak interestingly, I am CEO of the World Obesity Federation, and which it turns out to also be highly associated with severe complications of COVID. And as such, it's an equity issue, but I've been in Boston for the last 9 months. I was previously in Geneva for 9 years. So I've been sitting on both sides of the Atlantic on this issue at a personal as well as a professional level. So the US has a long-standing relationship with the World Health Organization, which, as you know, was founded in April 1948, coming out of the associated with the UN. And the US itself played a key role. John D. Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Foundation, their own international health programs helped form some of the core funding and the basis for WHO. The Pan American Health Organization for the Americas was formed at the early part of the last century. So it's a predecessor to WHO, but now also forms the Americas region of WHO. And that itself had its roots in trade in the Americas. So with the yellow fever, particularly around the yellow fever pandemic in the 1880s, which spread up sort of through the coastal areas, through maritime trade, down from Argentina and up through the US, where it killed 20,000 people. So there's a long history of trade and international relations with the US, forming the basis of the US engagement with WHO. As part of this, there were the international sanitary regulations, which were formed around stopping cholera, but meant again to really focus on how countries can engage in trade together, with strong roots in the trade across the Americas, across North and South America. So again, very strong US basis in this, which has its own roots in trade, which I think plays a role in what we're seeing now. The international sanitary regulations formed the basis of the international health regulations, the IHR, which we've heard a lot about in recent months, because the IHR requires countries to report fairly openly and does not penalize them. That's an important piece of this. Does not punish them for reporting openly about potential outbreaks in their regions. The IHR were updated and rewritten after SARS in 2002, 2003, understanding the role that sort of fear of impact on trade and tourism had played in silence around SARS. Important to note, the US was the main author of the revised international health regulations that were approved and adopted at the World Health Assembly in 2005. So again, strong relationships. The US, as we saw with Jean-Marc's slides on the US military, the US is also the largest donor to WHO. So I'll go a little bit into that in the next couple of slides. But again, on the IHR, the focus of IHR is to alert the global community. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of also fake news around when did China tell WHO, what role did Taiwan play, et cetera. The role of IHR, for the most part, countries generally adhere fairly well to IHR, but they also probably ignore it at the same time. We see that in Ebola, where countries did not want to sort of go along with a travel ban, so they just didn't give visas to citizens from the Ebola affected countries in 2014. We're seeing lots of ways that countries adhere to, but also selectively ignore the IHR. So for the most part, China was following protocols around IHR. It should be noted that when Gro Brundtland was Director General of WHO in the early 2000s, she did declare a travel ban for China around SARS, and that was a very considered a very political move to do that. That was something that certainly created some political challenges for her, but was seen as a moment of real leadership. The WHO is always, as with any multilateral agency, needing to work with, is at the will of its member states. In 2013, 2014, therefore, when Margaret Chan was DG, she was hesitant to declare a sort of an outbreak. And again, remember, an outbreak is a process that's declared well before there's a pandemic is declared. So with Ebola, with the Ebola outbreak that was taking place in West Africa at that time, it took quite a long time to declare that, and in the end, 11,000 people died, and that was seen as, in many ways, a failure of WHO not being assertive enough, being too careful, and not adhere, and countries not doing enough around IHR. So fast forward to 2020, Dr. Tedros has been quite open and vocal about COVID, the emerging coronavirus. Went to China, obviously, in January, but also was quite open and public about what was going on. The US has been part of that conversation at the outset. The US was certainly, there's strong US presence in WHO in terms of staff seconded from US Centers for Disease Control and other US agencies, and a number of sort of staff representing the US here in Geneva. And so it was certainly, I was at the executive board. It was a central topic of the EB, and the United States was absolutely a presence there. Now, WHO's overarching goal is attainment of, for all people, of the highest possible level of health. And that's achieved largely through setting normative standards, also through technical assistance, and through playing a global coordinating role. It's important to note here, and I'll just say a couple more things about WHO, is that it's operating on a budget of about $4 billion a year, which is roughly the equivalent of HUG, the hospital in Geneva. It is well below what the US CDC budget is. It's well below what the US National Institutes of Health budgets are. So it has this very ambitious and lofty goal, and far fewer resources than are needed to deliver on that. It has the triple billion targets, which were adopted in 2018 under Dr. Tedros, which are focused around the universal health coverage, protection against health emergencies, and ensuring that 1 billion more people ensure better health and well-being. As it turns out, COVID sits across all of those. Universal health coverage, strong systems, we're seeing the absence of consistently strong systems around the world. We're seeing that in things like absence of PPE. We're seeing it in absence of even monitoring and surveillance. And this isn't just a north-south divide. It's happening, as we're very clearly seeing, in the United States, where health systems are wildly inconsistent. We are seeing, and a reminder, the US spends more on health than any other country in the world, twice as much as Switzerland, which I believe comes in next, with health outcomes that are far below being even in the top 10 in terms of mortality and morbidity. So those are all sort of some of the environmental pieces around the what's going on with the WHO and the US relationship. So the US is the largest single donor to WHO. The next largest donor, the next largest donor to the WHO, though, is Bill Gates. So it's not one of the next countries, it is Bill Gates. The other countries that are sort of the largest donors largely map out against GDP. Japan is among the largest, UK, et cetera. What's interesting is the vast majority of funding, about more than 80% of funding to the WHO, is now restricted. It's considered voluntary. So assessed contributions are the membership dues to WHO. That 4 billion is 80% voluntary. If you think about that, that gives the WHO very little latitude to be able to respond quickly to new challenges. It's just simply struggling to pay to keep the lights on with the assessed contributions from member states, including WHO. And again, those budgets sit across many different functional areas. It's very difficult to create a cohesive response. In terms of the WHO budget and the US role in it, the shift has been largely from trade to aid, is how I would put it, and development funding has played an enormous role in how funding is delivered, and a lot of that those voluntary contributions are on the development and aid side. Very good, helping in lots of critical health issues, maternal and child health, HIV/AIDS, et cetera, but not allowing for new health challenges that emerge and not allowing for cross-cutting health challenges. As it turns out, two of the biggest health challenges in the world that we're witnessing right now, outbreaks and also the rise of non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, are diseases that affect everyone everywhere. This everyone everywhere model is something that WHO funding, its relationship with US and US funding have not caught up with. So there's distorted and misaligned funding and structures that make it very difficult for cohesive responses and again, contribute to some of the challenges. I think it boils down to in the US and WHO though, there has been a long-standing relationship between the two. But as the US is as populism is growing and as the US is currently in a situation of not trusting multilateral institutions, of a fairly anti-UN stance, WHO is paying the price. For the most part, what's going on is in many ways a distraction as well. Can the US relationship evolve with WHO in what I would call a multipolar world, which is what we seem to be? We're away from sort of the Cold War instruments that created things like the kind of funding models for WHO, but also US's own stance in terms of you're either with us or you're against us. That doesn't work in a health challenge like a pandemic where everyone is at risk, everyone is affected. That type of populism tends to be sort of not fairly disposed towards multilateral institutions. I'm conscious that we're short on time and that we're behind time, so I'm going to cut short my presentation, but I'm happy to bring additional perspectives, both as through my professional work, but also sitting here in the United States about some of the challenges that we're seeing right now. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from my other speakers.
Thanks, Johanna, for highlighting, giving us some background about WHO, its funding structure, and the fact that basically, as you mentioned, they have low latitude in terms of what they can do because they rely heavily on different countries. For our viewers, if you would like to ask questions to the panelists, you can do it. You have the Q&A tab, and so please send your question. Ashley is collecting them, and in the end we'll have a round of questions. May I ask also the other speakers to stick to the 8-9 minute rules because we want to keep it to 1 hour 30. Next on the list is Professor Hall Gardner. Hall, the mic is yours.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank Paul for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be part of the GCSP meeting today. I have a lot to say, and I'll try to do it in 8 minutes. So the COVID-19 pandemic is pressing American global strategy to reconsider options in military deployments with respect to Iran, China, and Russia, and other countries. But the pandemic is not fundamentally changing the new approach of great power competition, which has been defined as strategic predictability and operational unpredictability. However, I do think, as the first speaker stated, that we are into a new situation. We're going to be facing a $4 trillion deficit, and this is going to considerably force the US to reconsider both its defense spending that was talked about earlier, as well as its strategy. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about optional alternative strategies that we can foresee or hopefully discuss anyway in the coming era as the United States begins to meet the economic crisis, the global economic crisis. Rather than seeking a diplomatic approach that would bring all states together in the struggle against an invisible enemy, and seek to resolve their political military disputes, the US, China, Russia, and Iran have all been propagandizing against them. And the WHO, for example, has been in the crossfire between the US and China, as just discussed. Probably the most immediate impact of the coronavirus was on Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran. Here, the US Theodore Roosevelt incident, in which Captain Crozier was removed from his command for writing a letter in which he demanded resources from higher authorities that would have permitted him to move his crew on shore in order to save them from the spread of the coronavirus. directly impacted Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran and it likewise concurrently exposed problems in the naval bureaucracy and Trump's own administrative disarray. Crozier's letter stated that the US was not at war, sailors do not need to die. Nevertheless, Crozier's demand to disembark the crew forced the US Navy to redeploy a second aircraft carrier, the US Harry Truman, out of the Arab-Persian Gulf region and towards the Pacific. So this incident had at least a minimum effect on Trump's maximum pressure strategy, and Trump had to compensate for that by later saying that he would fire upon Iranian vessels that have been engaged in what's called swarming techniques against US warships. But the main point here is that the US Trump administrations failed miserably to change Iranian behavior. After Trump dumped the nuclear Iran accord set up by Obama, the JCPOA, Tehran has continued to push ahead on its nuclear enrichment program, and it just tested a new military satellite. The Trump administration had hoped to augment international pressures on the Iranian regime and prevent Iran from importing small arms at a time when Russia, Turkey, Turkey and India are all impacted by US sanctions on Iran, and they're not playing along with the US sanctions policy. In an effort to obtain international support, Trump ironically wants to claim that the US still belongs to the JCPOA. Now, this is very complicated, but it's very ironic that he's bringing this back. But let me just quote the Arms Control Association, who said, if the Trump administration is successful in bringing back UN sanctions, the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal will likely collapse, which will trigger a new nuclear crisis. Now, I think we have to think about alternatives here. Let me just point out a few alternatives, which I think perhaps a new administration or a second-term Trump administration, if he does win, because I'm not convinced he might win again, is to return to the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal and to negotiate a follow-on nuclear agreement that builds upon that deal. And this time we need to really, US needs to push for the missile technology control regime for the Middle East and prevent an all-out destabilizing arms transfers, prevent a destabilizing arms transfers to states in the Middle East. Most importantly, US needs to encourage Iran-Saudi negotiations to put an end to their proxy wars in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And finally, all states in the region and the world could pledge a no first use of any kind of weapon of mass destruction. I think these are goals that could be applied in the near future. But here's the point: even if the U.S. or Israel do not go to war with Iran as they have threatened, if Iran continues to develop an offensive missile capability and possibly a nuclear weapons capability, Trump's maximum pressure strategy risks the dangerous destabilization of Iraq and Iran. Iraq is already becoming a battlefield for the U.S. and Iran, as the killing of General Quds Commander Soleimani showed. And the collapse of energy prices, which hasn't mentioned here, will further destabilize both Iraq and Syria, by the way, opening up the door to Daesh, Islamic State, and also other possible Iraqi groups will arise, or other terrorist organizations. And even Daesh had said the covert virus provides them a new opportunity against the Crusader states. Now, ironically, the Theodore Roosevelt affair may have provided the Trump administration with a way to shift its focus towards China, while at the same time seeking to pressure Iran in other ways besides vulnerable aircraft carriers. The irony here is there's an increasing danger that the US aircraft carriers could be vulnerable to Iranian attack in the Strait of Hormuz. And on the other hand, the strategic focus on Iran has drawn the Trump administration away from its feared threat posed by China. Now here, as stated by General Joseph Votel in the House Armed Services Committee in February 2018, the Trump administration has feared that Tehran's eventual membership in the Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization would strengthen Iran's economic military capabilities. In effect, Iranian membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would represent a keystone that would solidify a Russia-China axis in Eurasia and throughout the wider Middle East as a threat to Israeli, Saudi, and US global interests. It would also, at the same time, China hopes to expand its hegemony in the South and East China Seas. Here's a point that's not brought out, I think, in the press. US maximum pressure strategy on Iran is intended to disrupt China's Bridge and Road Initiative and to break a burgeoning Sino-Russian alliance with Iran that is likewise trying to bring in states such as Turkey. We see Turkey flirting between Russia and NATO, Pakistan, increasingly caught in the Bridge and Road Initiative with China, and even the Philippines, former US ally that is playing between the US and China now. So in addition to expanding its Bridge and Road Initiative, Beijing, in forging a closer alliance with Russia and potentially Iran, has hoped to establish a Chinese version of the US Monroe Doctrine in the East and South China Seas, in rivalry with the regional ASEAN powers. At the same time, it's threatening to unify with Taiwan by force, as stated by President for Life Xi Jinping in January 2019. Now, just recently, as a proof of the tensions that are ongoing despite the coronavirus, the US Navy just engaged in another freedom of navigation operation in the Spratly Islands. Now, with respect to Russia, US and NATO have been engaging in a new military confrontation in Eastern Europe ever since the preclusive Russian annexation of Crimea and the political military interference in Eastern Ukraine, with military buildups in Kaliningrad and the Baltic Sea region, Crimea and the Black Sea region, and Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is coupled with Moscow's energy card designed to draw states closer to Russian interests, including Turkey and even Germany with its Nord Stream project. In response to alleged Russian violations of the INF Treaty, the United States dropped out of the INF Treaty and could soon drop out of New START, therefore removing all the significant arms control pacts that we've engaged in since the Cold War and after. And furthermore, these actions threaten to tear apart the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. Furthermore, the US and Russia and China are all engaged in a new arms race to develop hypersonic weaponry while deploying low-yield nuclear weapons on both tactical and long-range missile systems. This emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons and low-yield warheads, to my mind, indicates a move to develop an actual nuclear warfighting capability. In January 2008, in the National Defense Strategy, the US began to focus on great power competition with China and Russia, downplaying to some extent the global war on terrorism. The irony is that this strategy is pushing China, Russia, and Iran closer together so that their mutual interests outweigh their differences, and is concurrently unsettling US allies who cannot be certain if the US will come to their defenses. Here's just an example of that. The Trump administration just recently pulled out its heavy B-52 bombers, plus its B-1 and B-2 stealth bombers from Guam in order to reduce potential targets for China's so-called Guam killer missile and North Korea's missiles as well. But the problem is the US is deploying its bombers more randomly. It's argued that the United States can retract to the US mainland, deploy bases and deploy these weapons, these bombers from North Dakota and Louisiana. But then again, these deployments are farther away, and it takes longer for the US to bring these bombers to the areas in Asia where they might be deployed. And finally, the federal deficit is to approach $4 trillion, which will increase US demands for significant decreases in defense spending. Finally, my last point is what is needed is a new strategy, new diplomatic strategy that seeks to split the burgeoning alliance between Russia and China and that draws Russia closer to the United States and the European Union, while concurrently seeking a concerted US, European, Russian strategy that seeks to channel China's rise to hegemonic status. At the same time, the US, China, and Taiwan need to forge a new arrangement that builds upon the Taiwan Relations Act through the establishment of joint US-China international security guarantees for Taiwan and involving US-Chinese security cooperation and joint regional development projects in the South and East China Seas. To accomplish this means a totally new strategy in which the US needs to engage in a rapprochement. US and NATO need to engage in a rapprochement with Russia, and we begin to reduce this military buildup that I've just mentioned in Eastern Europe, in Crimea, and in the Baltic region, and likewise begin an rapprochement with China. So the irony, contrary to the Cold War strategy, which containment was ironically designed to push Russia and China together to keep them divided, this strategy seeks out a rapprochement with both Russia and China almost simultaneously. Once again, there will be no lasting settlement until the US, EU, and Russia begin to seek out a general entente. The US, EU, and Russia seek out a general entente while likewise engaging in dialogue to channel China's hegemonic ambitions. So I'll end right there. I know that's a lot of material, but I can discuss it if there's any questions after.
Thank you. That was not an easy task to actually review U.S. strategy towards three major states: Iran, Russia, and China. And basically, your point was that U.S. there needs to be a new strategy that seeks the rapprochement with Russia, so to keep Chinese hegemonic power in check. Right. The next speaker is René Schwack. The mic is yours.
Out of time. The first one is very obvious, but I have to make it. From a European point of view, the major problem is Donald Trump. I put it very simply. But from a European point of view, all the problems between the two sides, the two shores of the Atlantic, comes from the attitude of the American president. The Europeans, they want a free trade agreement with the US, impossible to make it. They want more American commitment to European defense, impossible to make it. They suffer from all the attacks by the American president on the European Union. They have the impression that Donald Trump wants simply the end of the European Union. And of course, what they hope, what they pray for is that Joe Biden will win the next elections. It has been said earlier by the first participant, Anne-Lorraine, that so far there are no reasons to be optimistic about the outcome of the elections, but if there's a deep economic and social depression in the US, maybe there will be a slight change, maybe 1-2%, but it could be sufficient in some swing states to make Biden the next president. And Europeans, they simply hope that Joe Biden will be the next president and that the situation in the terrible relationship between Europe and the US will change. So this is my first point. It's a very obvious one, but sometimes we have to say and to point out very obvious ones. Second point is about Italy. I think this is the major challenge, the most important challenge for Europe and for the stability of Europe. Italy obviously is the weakest link in Europe. Why? Because before the coronavirus crisis, the situation was already bad, economically, socially, politically, and now it's worse. in human terms, health situation was bad and still one of the worst in Europe. But the most important problems are economic and political. Economically, the debt was huge in Italy, and it will be even worse. Level of unemployment was high, it will be even worse. And the most important point is that the far-right parties are very popular. The Lega, the Brothers of Italy, and also Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia, they are roughly at the level of 50% of the intentions of the voters, and they could easily win the next elections. It's the only country in Europe where the situation is so bad from a political point of view. The European Union was created against extremism, far right or far left extremism. But now if far right parties in Italy gain power, it will be a lot of instability in Europe. And it will create tensions within the Eurozone. So therefore, we have all those discussions about solidarity with Italy. And so far it has not been very good, but the plans are very good. What has been on the table, not fully completed, I agree, but what is on the table for supporting Italy and other weakest parts of Europe is very important. We'll know more about it by May 7, but still, there's a lot of solidarity on the way. Now the key point is PR, information, how to convince the Italians that without the European Union, without the support of the wealthy country in Europe, like Germany, the Netherlands, etc., they could not survive, and that they have to avoid extremist policies, populist policies, etc. So my second point was about Italy. It is the main
Looks like we have a problem with Renee. So I suggest that we move to Jamie. Jamie, are you ready to take over?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jean-Marc.
I'm very sorry. That's also
no. I'm always
happened.
as a former international civil servant, I always have to be ready for anything. No, but I sincerely hope we can get Rennie back, of course. First, thanks very much, Jean-Marc, Ashley, Paul, the GCSP. Always great to engage. When you're number 5, or at least in my case, number 4.5 on the speakers list, you know that all of the important things have already been said, unfortunately not by me. But the exam question, Jean-Marc, that you gave me was to look a little bit of the impact on NATO. So let me stick to that, and I'll also stick to the 8 minutes. First of all, I think NATO has had a good crisis thus far. The alliance has shown that all of the structures that were created to fight conflicts, to deter conflicts, to deal with military operations, those structures have proven remarkably useful and resilient at dealing with other problems. Like, for example, NATO has handled cybersecurity, or has handled floods or forest fires in Europe, or even sent a NATO response force to Pakistan to deal with an earthquake back in 2005. And therefore, things like NATO's airlift capability, its consortium of C-17 strategic lift aircraft based in Hungary, its SALIS air consortium, these things have allowed it quickly to identify spare cargo planes which have been sent to China, which have been sent to various allied countries to pick up supplies of respirators, of protective medical clothing, and transport them to other allies. So I think NATO has shown, maybe even better than the EU, that solidarity among allies has worked well during this crisis. I would have liked, as a former NATO public servant, to have seen a greater transatlantic dimension to that assistance, rather than Chinese or Russian supplies arriving in the United States or in places like Italy or Spain. But nonetheless, the military, I think, have shown in this crisis that they are really indispensable. In my country, the British Army has been constructing 6 field hospitals. It's been doing the testing, a lot of the logistics and the planning. Many other NATO countries have also deployed their military to transport patients from one country to another, and so on and so forth. So to some degree, a crisis of this dimension is not just an economic or a health crisis, it also is a security crisis. And I think you could argue that rather than show the non-relevance of military forces, the crisis has shown that military forces are indeed, in a real crisis, the essential adjunct to the civilian power in terms of social resilience. Now, that said, what NATO has to do is not just to have a good medical crisis, it also has to be able to continue, as Lyndon Johnson would have said, to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. And Hal referred to some of the issues that I would briefly mention as well. Clearly, the rest of the world geopolitics, Hal make this clear, doesn't stop because we're all looking inward and we're focusing on our immediate health crisis or economic crisis at home. Indeed, not only does geopolitics continue as normal, but it's even reinforced as countries like China in the South China Sea are cracking down on dissidents in Hong Kong, Iran, with the launch of its military satellite and trying to harass American military ships in the Gulf. Russia flying its Tupolev bomber aircraft close to the United Kingdom over the Baltic and so on. Great powers may be tempted to sort of use what they feel is the diversion of NATO allies at home to push their sort of geopolitical pawns even further out. So I think the test for NATO coming up is to be able to demonstrate its utility in handling something like a pandemic at home, while at the same time not keeping its eye off the geopolitical ball. For example, Afghanistan. We have 14,000 US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. It's a tricky period in the wake of the conclusion, of course, of the agreement between the United States and the Taliban. US forces are being withdrawn, but so far there is no peace process, no ceasefire. 700 civilians have been killed or wounded over the last few weeks. So far, therefore, we may be in a situation where we're pulling the security plug from Afghanistan faster than we're putting in place a political process. So we have to keep an eye on that. Second example is Iraq, where the United States prior to the crisis was asking NATO to step up to the plate and take over many of the US training operations for the Iraqi forces, something which NATO has agreed to do. Third example is Africa, where before the crisis, France in particular, but many EU countries were worried by the signs from the Pentagon that the United States was going to withdraw or draw down its rather modest forces in West Africa, but in places like Mali, the Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, where we know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups are reconstituting, those American assets in terms of special forces, in terms of drones, in terms of intelligence were extremely important indeed. And Hal mentioned, of course, some of the other issues, particularly in the area of looking at NATO's nuclear strategy in the wake of the US abrogation of the INF Treaty and Russia's deployment of the SSC-8 cruise missiles in Kaliningrad and elsewhere. What does NATO do about that? And so on and so forth. Indeed, the crisis has had one big impact on NATO, which is that it has led to the cancellation or at least the reduction of major exercises like Defender Europe, which should have kicked kicked off in March, which for the first time since the end of the Cold War was going to send about 20 to 30,000 US forces back to Europe to demonstrate that, you know, if push came to shove and there really were a crisis in Europe, the Americans would be able to get there in time, you know, with military mobility, with logistics, with airlift, and so on. And that was an important test for the validity of NATO's new strategy, which is to have a light presence in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, but rely crucially on early warning and reinforcement to prevent any kind of loss of territory. So first conclusion, NATO has to deal with a crisis, but it also has to show that it can keep the eye on the ball elsewhere. Second conclusion, obviously defense spending. Ironically, before the crisis, burden sharing was starting to move in a good direction for the alliance. Trump was starting to make some more favorable noises, like at the London leaders meeting last December when NATO marked its 70th anniversary, by, for the first time, acknowledging that the 10 now non-US NATO member states have reached the 2% of GDP on defense spending. That you referred, Jean-Marc, in your introduction to the IFRI report, which also showed, would you believe it, that one of the largest increases proportionately in defense spending over the last year has come from Germany, the country which, of course, President Trump has been criticizing. And NATO was signaling to the Trump administration that by 2024, which is the target date for this so-called burden sharing initiative, about half of the allies would be on 2%, and the others would be moving in the right direction. But of course, all bets are off, Jean-Marc, all bets are off now that we have had this coronavirus, which ironically is going to allow nearly everybody in NATO to hit 2%, simply because the economies and the GDPs are shrinking so quickly. But of course, and Hal also pointed this out, and others too, is going to make it more difficult, of course, for both the United States and Europe to maintain their current military modernization programs. And therefore, how do we redefine that burden sharing debate afterwards? The third issue for NATO concerns China. Before the coronavirus, NATO had done something remarkable, which was to do its first serious geopolitical intelligence analysis as an alliance on China, and basically agree that this was a topic which NATO would keep under review. Over 70 different work strands were started in NATO headquarters to analyze all of the dimensions of China, its economic power, its military power, its technology power, the impact, of course, of China acquiring more innovation and industrial technology in Europe. And of course, in the wake of the coronavirus, this debate about whether a weakened Europe would be even more vulnerable to Chinese investments in critical industry, not just the Huawei 5G debate, will continue. And I imagine that once the crisis is over, given inevitably in security terms, the more negative image that China is going to have in the alliance in general. And you've got to remember, Jean-Marc, that it's not just Republicans, but it's also Democrats in the United States who are tough on China. Any of you who were at the Munich Security Conference and listened to Nancy Pelosi's speech would have found that indistinguishable from what Vice President Pence said on China. So NATO is going to have to somehow keep its eye on two particular geopolitical actors, Russia and China, who of course are not the same. This is absolutely clear, and NATO won't want to lump them together. But there will be certain allies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, who will continue to want the emphasis to be put on Russia for obvious geographical reasons. There'll be others who will be more alive to what they see as the greater geostrategic, economic, technological challenge from China, and want NATO to be more focused on that. I think this is going to be one of the things to watch. The next thing, of course, is, does NATO become an organization which handles pandemics, and particularly bio threats? I mean, if I were a dictator somewhere, I would have looked with great stupefaction, but also interest, that a virus like coronavirus can incapacitate a US aircraft carrier, can lead to the cancellation of US rotations, of US deployments. Even President Trump the other day was saying that he wanted to prematurely pull all of the US forces out of Afghanistan because they could be contaminated with the virus if they stayed there. But it's not just the US. US. A Dutch submarine has been recalled to port. Many European allies have had problems with the coronavirus, which have curtailed military activities and confined troops to barracks, cancelled exercises. Now, I would, if I were a dictator, draw the conclusion that if I wanted to incapacitate NATO, a bug is probably better than a bug missile or any other type of weapon. And again, we now have the problem, which was there already after the Russian chemical attack with the Novichok nerve agent in Salisbury a couple of years ago, of how do we increase our so-called CBRN resistance, particularly to bio threats, and what NATO does in future, given the inevitability of another pandemic, to plan, to organize, to stockpile, to be better able, again, to support the civilian authority in handling this kind of situation. Finally, European strategic autonomy. Again, I'm not arguing that the coronavirus has done anything new for NATO or anything new for geopolitics. I see the virus as an accelerator or an exacerbator of trends that were already there. But as you know well, before the virus, President Macron and others in Europe were beating the drum for greater European self-reliance. The pandemic has only shown that we're going to a more dangerous, tougher, less charitable world out there of international rivalry and competition. The EU High Representative for the Foreign and Common Security Policy, Josep Borrell, has said, you know, Europe has to speak the language of power. And before the virus, the new Commission was looking at, you know, a European Defence Fund and more cooperation among Europeans in their with technology, with defence programs, with their armed forces. The idea being that the EU could stand on its own 2 feet and be able to defend its interests even where the United States was not engaged. And given, of course, the absence of US leadership as we traditionally have known it, not only since the advent of Trump, I think also this goes back to the Obama administration too, the notion that in the neighborhood, in the Middle East, in Africa, the Europeans need to stand on their own 2 feet. This debate will only continue, but we still have NATO. I personally still believe that we need American leadership. I don't see the EU strategic autonomy as substituting for the transatlantic link. So even if Joe Biden is elected and the tone becomes friendlier, the 3 key challenges will still be there. What are those 3 key challenges? Number one, how do we build a common transatlantic sense of purpose in the alliance in dealing with the big issues like Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and everything else? When President Macron, in his famous Economist article, said that NATO was brain dead, what he actually had said was that NATO itself works well as a military organization, but the alliance, the notion of a transatlantic community consulting politically and coming to common positions, was not working. Some of you may know that just before the virus struck, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, appointed a group of experts to look a little bit at the future of NATO in terms of improving political consultation. It's going to be very interesting to see what it comes up with. Secondly, how do we deal with the burden sharing issue, which will only become more acute when the problems are all there, but our economic resources to deal with them have dwindled massively as the result of the economic contraction. And then a third issue is that Europe and the United States will disagree. We've always disagreed, although that used to be overshadowed by the glue of the Soviet threat. And we're going to disagree in future on trade, on data privacy, on how to handle China, on a host of issues. But how do we manage to disagree without this being interpreted on both sides of the Atlantic as betrayal, as treachery, as treason? You know, if you're not following me blindly, you're against me, that type of thing. You know, how can we have a more adult kind of relationship where we can manage our differences perhaps more successfully than we've been able to do so over the last 4 years? I don't know if that was 8 minutes. It felt like it, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you again for inviting me on today.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. It was slightly more than 8 minutes.
Sorry.
And for the sake of time, because the webinar will stop at 5:30, so I would like to have all the speakers lined up. René, are you back with us? Can you will you just resume your presentation? Also, ask you to be brief.
Yeah.
René, yeah.
Just one sentence. So I argue that European institutions will be stronger after the coronavirus because they will get more money, especially the Commission, money for spending, not for lending. It will be grants, it won't be loans. And so the budget of the Commission will be much higher than the budget of Russia, for instance. So this is one point people don't see. And also other European institutions will be stronger. So there will be more important interlocutors to the US on trade and financial matters, but clearly not on security and defense matters. Nothing will change, and the European Union will remain a dwarf in those security and defense matters. I will stop here.
Thank you. So in a way, we can combine what Jeremy and you said about rebalancing, and that Jeremy highlighted that yes, Germany is also one of the biggest spender, but in the latest CIPRI report. But with the current crisis, it will completely change asset allocation by states, and the enduring debate of costs and who bear the cost in NATO will probably continue. The last speaker, Paul, can I ask you also to be brief? Thank you.
Yes. Oops, sorry. Slight. Thank you, Jean-Marc, and thank you to everyone for their previous comments. I'll try to indeed very quickly rush through and add on what's everything's been said with my remark on narratives. And when I'm talking about narratives, of course, I want to focus especially on discourse and messages that we've heard, well, perhaps mainly from official quarters, from leaders, and how much that's been reflected perhaps in the media discourse too. Now, of course, it's a frequent observation that predates the crises and the pandemic that American and European views have been divergent, and on this pandemic, we've had no difference as well too. Very strong, I think, marked preoccupations. Added to the fact that, of course, the timelines of the pandemic haven't been exactly in sync in Europe and in the United States in terms of the spread of the pandemic as well too. So that's commanded some different attitudes and messages at times too. And finally, of course, a particularity that's been highlighted in other talks is the fact that the US is in this election year. And that's, I think, given a particular political force to the kind of narratives hearing from the US. So what I'd very briefly like to focus on is perhaps to show you one example of a major theme that's come out of the US narrative on this crisis. That contrasts in the second point to what's been the major theme that I'd see coming out from the European narratives. And finally, point out a few areas of points of convergence, but that doesn't really is going to help entirely the two views to be reconciled. So what I'd say first about the major theme that emerges in the US narrative, and in part from the declarations of Donald Trump, because we've seen him take the really unprecedented and unimitated tactic among his European counterparts of giving these daily press briefings that have had the both an electoral function and of course we're also meant to give out some sort of public information about the state of the crisis. But what has been quite consistent in this US narrative is this emphasis on the fact that we're here in the presence of a foreign originating crisis. And that tends to link up with preoccupations that have been expressed by Donald Trump and his supporters over the years, that most of the problems come from abroad and are not homegrown. Obviously, you've all heard about the expressions of his emphasis on the Chinese virus, on the foreign virus, and now something we hear more often is the invisible enemy. But there's a lot of double entendre behind that too as well. Obviously, as I was saying, the narrative was impacted by the fact that the crisis, the pandemic took a little longer to reach in massive elements the US territory than Europe. There was this decision quite early on by the US administration to cut air links to China. At the time, this was seen as then generating a problem because you needed to organize repatriation flights for people who were out. The Europeans kind of followed suit on that as well. There was another, of course, well-known case, which was the passengers of the Diamond Princess who were in quarantine in Japan as well, that also underlined the foreign dimension of the problem at first. And then later on, as the disease spread in Europe, there was the decision that was taken without consultation, and that really upset a lot of Europeans to sever the air links with Europe as well. And that created another big logistical repatriation headache on both sides of the Atlantic. So what we get out of this, the tendencies that come out of this narrative of the crises being a foreign originating crisis, there's been this tendency that lasted quite long in Donald Trump's declaration to minimize the gravity of the virus and of the disease. There's also, of course, an element that's now gone over to the domestic scene of shifting blame to others from Washington to abroad, but also now to local authorities in the US on how to handle adequately the crises. There's been consistent claims that the sanitary response in the US was supposedly more efficient there than in other cases, and that's been dispelled quite early because of the problems detected with the testing systems that the CDC had first put out as well too. And now, of course, one important theme that's emerging in this narrative are the arguments about when and how fast to end up the lockdown. And you're seeing the economic priorities and the fear of an impact on the election becoming very present in this whole discourse. And the latest move to cancel the attribution of all green cards, even to legal immigration, kind of reflects this preoccupation. At the opposite point of view, the major theme I'd see among the Europeans, and that's also something that predates the crisis as well, is this preoccupation with the breakdown of the multilateral way of doing business. And as has been stressed by other speakers, the origin of that is attributed mainly to US policy as well too. Now, of course, it also masks the fact, and I think René mentioned that as well too, that originally, even amongst the Europeans, there wasn't a very good coordinated response to it at first, especially with the early bans on supplying of medical equipment to the worst hit states. I mean, it's slightly improved since, with especially with the schemes of patient sharing. They've done, I think, a lot to repair relations as well too. I've already alluded to the fact that yes, there was a European annoyance expressed when the US shut off its air links and travel links to Europe, and that's not over yet. There've also been, of course, a particular aspect which was expressed by some European political leaders as a crisis unfolded, about a fear about unfair competition by the US for access to medical supplies. This is one aspect which we saw the affair of that was highlighted in Germany by this attempt by the US to buy into this pharmaceutical firm that was developing a vaccine and that wanted an exclusivity of trial and use, and that didn't help the climate as well. It was also expressed, I think in particular, some French politicians, local politicians who are trying to supply masks to their own constituents, who were ordering them en masse in China, and then started declaring when the masks weren't delivered that they had been outbid all of a sudden by some unknown, U.S. competitors who had shown up in China and basically bought all the masks instead of the Europeans. And the ironic aspect of this was that it seemed to want to shift the blame to these U.S. interlopers rather than to the Chinese sellers for going over their contracts as well too. So you had a lot of blame shifting there too as well. And we've also noted, of course, the negative European reaction to the decision to suspend US contributions to the WHO. Now, perhaps one last theme that might emerge quite dominantly in the European narrative on this point is that now we're going to see this enormous disease cluster in the US, and Loren's been very eloquent about the fallout of that, and that's going to have some kind of impact on Europe, no matter how small the ties are being reduced in this pandemic climate. So, of course, how will it be possible to reestablish the normally strong transatlantic interaction in trade, in economics, in finance, in health cooperation, political and military cooperation as well? If there's a US economic collapse, what's going to be the fallout on the European recovery as well too? And I'd like to end up on some areas of convergence, strangely enough. Whereas we saw this early emphasis in the US on, blaming China on this matter, it's interesting to see that, now some of the Europeans are actually nodding along and of course observing that, yes, there has been a bit of a China problem in respect to data sharing, to influence over the WHO. Obviously, in some ways there's a point of convergence between Europeans and Americans on this matter. What we're also seeing in terms of the trends of the messages as well too, is that the Europeans are going to experience, just like the Americans, the same kind of fraught debate on sanitary versus economic concerns and what should be prioritized now. The Europeans themselves have not been immune either to what we've seen in the US discourse on the emergence of conspiracy theories all around the origins of the pandemic and how to treat it as well too. There's of course, for instance, something we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic is the politicization of the promotion of particular cures or treatments that are supposed to be more efficient than others, and which political opponents to the governments in place have been highlighting to say, well, if I were in charge, I would do this differently, but not necessarily backed up with the medical appropriateness of these statements as well too. And there is this issue that will be similar in Europe and in the US about how to exactly coordinate reopening efforts, which are going to vary according to the sanitary and economic situation in various places. So that will be, of course, a difficulty on the cohesion inside the United States and also inside Europe as well too. I mean, no small challenge for whoever's in leadership in the next few months. So I'd finally like to, conclude that, one of the big questions that is really going to be similar on perhaps both sides of the Atlantic is that, will there be any efforts to coordinate an economic response? And that will be all the more difficult when multilateralism is in a sad state on both sides of the Atlantic. So to sum up, I'd add that the crisis has really exacerbated differences of opinion amongst American and European leaders. We've already had a damaged working culture between them that's going to require additional efforts to fix as well. And there's this climate of increased suspicion that we see overall. So,
well, yeah, right. Thank you. Unfortunately, on that note, we'll have to end on that note because our session is timed for 19 minutes and the session will end in 2 minutes. So I know there has been lots of questions from the audience. Very sorry that we cannot address them. There has been more than 60 questions that have been raised. Some of them have been answered during this webinar session. I know that it's bound to be a frustration, and I hope that we'll be able to overcome that with further webinars. So I would first like to thank all the speakers for today, even though we had a few technological mishaps, but that's the nature of doing this thing remotely. And I would like to also, before I conclude, to tell you about the next session next week. on Wednesday, 6th of May, that will be about strategic anticipation and foresight. What can we learn from this crisis about foresight and strategic anticipation for future international events? On that note, again, very sorry we could not go into the Q&A session. I wish you all the best. Hopefully, we'll see you next week. And again, thank you to the speaker. Until next time, stay safe. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.